What do you think the chances are that you would have to go to the hospital if you got COVID? And Democrats thought that was way higher than Republicans. 41% of Democrats, and the answer is between 1 and 5%.
Okay.
41% of Democrats thought it was over 50%. Another 28% thought it was 20 to 49%. So 70% of Democrats thought it was way, way, way higher than it really was. Liberal media has to take a little responsibility for that, for scaring the shit out of people.
What did the COVID pandemic reveal about people's mental states? And by mental states, I mean both their emotional health and their ability to think critically about the events of the day. I think reflecting on that is a worthy endeavor because we're probably going to have something like this happen again, be it another pandemic or some other crisis that's going to affect society in a very profound way. So it's a good idea to analyze what happened and prepare yourself for the next time something like this happened. And that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of this video. Before I get too deep into the weeds here, I want to put out a little disclaimer. Some of what I talk about here is going to seem critical of COVID vaccine policy. But on that note, I have no opinion as to whether or not you personally should be vaccinated. The reason I don't is because I don't know who you are or what your risk factors are. And even if I did, it's not really your private medical decisions aren't my business. That's between you and your doctor as far as I'm concerned, so I'm definitely don't take anything I say here as medical advice. I'm merely analyzing the public policy that came about during COVID and people's public reaction to it. Now, me personally, I chose not to get vaccinated. Reason being, I'm relatively young, I have no comorbidities. Relatively early on during the pandemic, before the vaccine was even developed, we had a ton of data on who was most vulnerable, who was most likely to have a severe case of COVID that would end in them being hospitalized or, and even in the extreme cases, dying. And I didn't fall into any of those groups, and already having COVID, having exposed to the virus, getting over it, I figured I already had natural immunity, so why am I going to take this newly developed vaccine on top of that? A vaccine that has no long-term studies. Certainly at the time, they came out with it, I believe, November of 2020 is when the vaccine was first officially developed, and then over the next several months they started to roll it out and actually administer it to people. So obviously, if they just came out with something, there hasn't been any long-term studies, any 5-10-year studies on possible side effects to this particular treatment. So frankly, I knew they were lying. I knew they were lying when they came out and said this was safe and effective, because how can you say it's safe when there's no long-term studies? And since I'm not at high risk, the gamble didn't seem worth it to me. Just a simple cost-benefit analysis. I'm not likely to get a severe case of COVID, not likely to be hospitalized with it, and I'm certainly not likely to die from COVID. So why would I take this experimental treatment? Especially since I already was exposed to it and presumably have some degree of natural immunity. So if I get it again in the future, if I get a different variant, I'm even less likely to have a severe reaction to it. Now, obviously, not everybody's in that same boat, so that's why I'm trying to make it clear at the beginning of this video, I have no opinion as to whether or not you should be vaccinated. Obviously, if I was much older, or if I was much sicker, if I had a lot of comorbidities, well, then it would be a different equation, and I would have a different cost-benefit analysis to weigh. And in my opinion, that's how people should be thinking about everything. That's how I try to think about everything. Everything is a cost-benefit analysis. As Thomas Sowell puts it, there's no solutions in life, there's just trade-offs. What we think of as liberty, individual liberty in society, is merely leaving people alone and letting them navigate those trade-offs in the way that they see fit. Because after all, who am I to tell somebody else how they should live? And I would say, in whatever area of your life that you're not thinking that way, if you're not analytical and thinking about cost versus benefit, those are the areas of your life that you're likely to screw up. Like if you're in a emotional state, in a deep emotional state, if you're scared or if you're in love or whatever emotion that's got a hold of you, that's going to cloud your judgment and get you to make bad decisions because you're going to overlook the cost and overstate the benefit, or vice versa, and you're going to make bad decisions because intense emotion suppresses your higher cognitive functions. It warps your ability to make sound decisions. Intense emotion is similar to intoxication. So I would liken intense emotion to intoxication. Somebody who's drunk is likely to overestimate or be overconfident in their ability to do things while they're drunk. Reason being, alcohol suppresses their higher cognitive functions. So they might think they're good to drive, even though they're clearly not to anybody who's around them that's sober. I would argue that emotion does likewise for people. Think of somebody who's infatuated. And if you've lived long enough, probably everybody's had this experience. If you had a crush or an infatuation, and as you idolize this person, in their eyes, everything about them is perfect and they can do no wrong, despite evidence to the contrary. This is why people get involved with people that clearly aren't right for them. This is why people stay in toxic relationships. Not the only reason, but certainly a very common reason why people stay in bad relationships is because they have a warped view of the person that they're staying with. Anger might be another intense emotion that clouds people's judgment. How many people have said or did something that they regret because they were in a very angry state at the time? If you type up an angry email, before you send it to somebody, set it aside and get a good night's sleep, reread it the next day or maybe a few days later, and see if you really want to still send that email. The reason that's good advice in a lot of cases is because it's understood that emotion clouds people's judgment and they do things and say things they regret when they're in an emotional state. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, it's my contention that the fear and stress of the pandemic just drove a lot of people insane and desperate to be led to safety. And unfortunately, a lot of the people in leadership were corrupt and incompetent and led a lot of these people down paths that made absolutely no sense. And it went beyond just enacting a bunch of silly policies that weren't all that effective, although there was plenty of that. But they also targeted people and tried to make them sort of scapegoat. They targeted people like me. Why? Because I made the perfectly logical decision not to get an experimental vaccine that they had no long-term studies on. For that, I'm called all kinds of names, accused of all sorts of things, and none of them make much sense. Like, all the arguments just fall flat on their face. So they call me anti-science. Again, because I refuse to get an experimental vaccine. Anti-science. What science are we talking about? There's no long-term studies. Where's your data? I'm just supposed to take the word of the people that are producing these vaccines that tell me that they're safe. That's not how science works. Science is data, it's studies, it's research, it's peer-reviewed. And at the time they were trying to mandate these things, there was no long-term studies. In fact, what are we, 2-3 years out? There still isn't a 5-year study on the long-term effects of these vaccines, or potential effects. So in addition to calling me anti-science, they called me anti-vax. Not anti-vax. When I was a kid, I had all the regular vaccines. Obviously when I was a kid, I didn't really consent to it. It's just something my parents took me to get. But, even if I had been old enough to consent to it, I wouldn't have had a problem with those vaccines, more than likely, because they were all whatever the standard barrage of vaccines that they give you: measles, mumps, probably smallpox, things like that. All those vaccines have been around for a long time, and there's a known safety profile on them. Again, the new mRNA vaccine that they came out with, not so. This is a new technology. There's no long-term studies on the effects of this vaccine. In my mind, taking it is a gamble that, just hoping that it doesn't have any side effects. And in my case, I wasn't at high risk of COVID, so why would I take that gamble? I wasn't at high risk of being hospitalized or dying from COVID. You know how I know that? Because I actually do trust the science, which is a dumb way to say things. You don't trust science. Science is a process. But at the time, all the data was showing like the average age of the person that was dying was COVID was like in their 80s. And aside from people that were sick to begin with, younger people generally weren't dying from COVID. So why would I take this gamble with this experimental vaccine? So let's see. They tell me I don't trust science. They tell me I'm anti-vax. What else do they tell me? If I don't get this vaccine, I'm going to endanger other people. Some version of you're going to kill my grandmother. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. For one, what's stopping your grandmother from getting the vaccine, or whoever you're worried that's in danger? Why can't they get the vaccine? I'm told it's safe and effective, right? So they should get it and they should be good. It shouldn't really matter what I do. Why is what I do affect the efficacy of your vaccine? That doesn't compute in my head. I mean, think about that. Your vaccine doesn't work unless I get it. It's kind of a moot point anyway, because it turns out they're not as effective as they were originally advertised.
You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
These vaccines are highly, highly effective.
Vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
They're really, really good against variants.
Everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission to other people and allowing society to get back to normal.
Get your first shot, and when you're due for your second, get your second shot.
A key goal is to stop the transmission, to get the immunity levels up so that you get almost no infection going on whatsoever.
When people are vaccinated, they can feel safe that they are not going to get infected.
If you're vaccinated, you're not going to be hospitalized, you're not going to be in an ICU unit, and you're not going to die. If you are fully vaccinated, you no longer need to wear a mask.
I mean, originally we were told by none other than Joe Biden and many other people as well in the media and in politics that if we just go out and get this vaccine, then we're good. We can't get COVID. And this is what people believed when they first started rolling out the vaccine. Then you started to hear reports of breakthrough cases.
Breakthrough cases can refer to a couple of things here. Most commonly, it's being used to refer to somebody who has an infection with COVID-19 despite being vaccinated. I think that is a definition that's a little bit overly broad because many of the people who are vaccinated have little to no symptoms, and we're only finding out about this because we're doing testing before procedures or testing before travel. So that ends up making it sound like the vaccines aren't necessarily working as well as they should. What the vaccines were really built for and what they do quite admirably is reduce the incidence of severe disease, meaning those who get hospitalized. We are seeing some breakthrough hospitalizations where someone's vaccinated and still get severe disease. In most of these cases, the disease probably would still be worse if they hadn't been vaccinated in the first place. But we're also seeing that these breakthrough hospitalizations tend to happen in people who we'd expect to have weaker immune systems and might not have the same lasting protection from the vaccines. When we look at where these breakthroughs that get hospitalized come from, they do fit into a few categories, all of which seem to point to having a weakened immune system, such as people who are transplant patients who are on active chemotherapy and a few related illnesses. We haven't yet been able to rank what the relative risk is of all these. Fortunately, these are rare enough that it's going to take a little bit of time to actually study them methodically and get enough of them to say where trends really exist.
And at first, we were told that these were extremely rare. These were very old, sick people that, whatever, maybe their immune systems weren't strong enough to have an adequate response to the vaccine, so it really didn't prime them against infection, whatever the rationale was. There was scattered stories of breakthrough cases, But they were largely dismissed as, well, this is the rare exception. But then fast forward a few months, around the time the so-called Omicron variant was going around, everybody and their brother was getting COVID, whether they were vaccinated or not. So clearly, being vaccinated with this mRNA vaccine doesn't prevent transmission or infection. Meaning, it doesn't really make any difference whether I get vaccinated. I can still be infected with COVID, and I can still pass it along to other people. But then they shift the narrative. Well, we never said that it would prevent transmission and infection. When, I don't know if the Pfizer spokesperson specifically said that, but certainly all the people, all the politicians, all the people in the media pushing this vaccine were saying it was safe and effective, and that if you got it, you wouldn't have to worry about getting COVID. Well, then they shifted and said, "Oh no, we never said that, but it will prevent you from getting a severe case of COVID." Well, it's interesting how the goalpost has shifted significantly from get the vaccine and you stop the virus to, oh, get the vaccine and probably won't get it as bad when you eventually do get COVID. But again, I'm not in a high risk category to begin with, so after it became obvious that the vaccine didn't actually prevent transmission and infection, I had even less incentive to go out and get it. This was when Omicron was going around, and pretty sure I got it. I was sick for a few days. I didn't bother to go get tested because I was off work at that time anyway. So why go wait outside some testing center in a long line with a bunch of other sick people when I was off work and I was going to be staying home anyway. But I'm pretty sure I had Omicron at that time, pretty much all the symptoms, and that was going around like wildfire at the time. And around this time is when President Joe Biden decided he was going to use the regulatory state. He was going to use OSHA to try to force employers to require everybody that they employ to get vaccinated. Basically, any employer with over 200 employees, OSHA was going to put this requirement on it that all their employees needed to be vaxxed or submit to like weekly testing or something like that.
No, I don't think it should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand to be mandatory, but I would do everything in my power, just like I don't think masks have to be made mandatory nationwide. My plan will extend the vaccination requirements that I previously issued in the healthcare field. Already, I've announced we'll be requiring vaccinations of all nursing home workers who treat patients on Medicare and Medicaid because I have that federal authority. Tonight, I'm using that same authority to expand that to cover those who work in hospitals, home health care facilities, or other medical facilities. I will sign an executive order that will now require all executive branch federal employees to be vaccinated, all. And I've signed another executive order that will require federal contractors to do the same. If you want to work with the federal government and do business with us, get vaccinated. I'm announcing that the Department of Labor is developing an emergency rule to require all employers with 100 or more employees that together employ over 80 million workers to ensure their workforces are fully vaccinated or show a negative test at least once a week.
Which in my mind, I thought, okay, a lot of employers aren't going to bother with this testing. They're just going to force everybody to get vaccinated or they're going to lose their jobs. So now I'm being threatened with potentially losing my job because I'm refusing to get this experimental vaccine for an illness that I've already had and gotten over with. And luckily I don't work in the healthcare sector. Luckily I'm not in the military because a lot of those people did end up losing their jobs. In my case, the Supreme Court stepped in before this Biden decree went into effect, and they put a stop to it. But like in New York, I remember reading that like 70,000 healthcare workers got fired for not getting vaccinated. Now let's think about this. A lot of these are obviously working age people in the healthcare industry. A lot of them were probably healthcare workers during the initial phase of the pandemic before there was a vaccine. And at that time they were heroes. Remember all the signs that said, basically healthcare workers are heroes in one form or another. So here they are on the front lines treating sick people before there's a vaccine, before we even have all the data on the risk factors in that. Many of them probably got exposed to it, probably had COVID, whether it was asymptomatic or whether they got sicker from it. A lot of them probably already have natural immunity because they're frontline healthcare workers and they've been exposed to this since the beginning of the pandemic. Those people, they're going to fire those people for not getting the vaccine. And they're going to do it gleefully. They're going to call these people names. They're anti-science. They're just crazy people. And what was the justification? So, the justification for this is, well, if we don't force everybody to get vaccinated, some of these people that don't get vaccinated are going to get COVID and they're going to get sicker than they need to, and they're going to end up in a hospital, and that's going to crowd the hospitals, and there's not going to be enough hospital beds to go around, or medical supplies, or whatever. They're going to deplete the resources of the hospital because they're refusing to get this vaccine. Okay, well, again, look at the individuals that are refusing to get vaccinated. Do they have natural immunity? Are they under a certain age where they're not at high risk of getting COVID? Do they have or not have any comorbidities that put them at undue risk? If they have none of those, if they're just young, healthy people, they're not likely to get severe COVID and be hospitalized anyway. And the whole policy is self-defeating. If you're truly worried about hospitals being overrun and not having enough resources to go around, well, firing 70,000 of them, firing 70,000 healthcare workers, well, that's going to create a shortage. Did you ever think about that? You ever think about all the people that maybe just wanted to get their cancer screening, or maybe they were waiting for a surgery, or any number of other things that got postponed and delayed because, well, we laid off all these healthcare workers. Because what? We were worried about a few of them getting severe COVID and taking up a hospital bed? That makes a lot of sense. And I really want to highlight the otherization and the demonization of people during the pandemic. People like me. Millions of Americans like me were otherized and demonized for our own personal medical decisions during the pandemic. And this was from mainstream sources, pundits on major cable news networks. Now, I happen to think cable news is garbage and really watch any of it. But the only time I watch cable news is when somebody's citing it, making fun of it on YouTube or somewhere. So I'll see clips of it, but I stopped watching it a long time ago.
Yet there's an us versus them narrative being pushed by the White House and the media, and they sound identical. It's like when someone shows up at a party dressed exactly like another guest and everybody asks, hey, did you two call each other? It's exactly what we should be asking Jen Psaki and Don Lemon. Here's Joe.
Millions of Americans are still unvaccinated, and because of that, their communities are at risk. Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated. We have the tools to combat COVID-19, and a distinct minority of Americans are keeping us from turning the corner. What more is there to wait for? What more do you need to see? We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin.
This is from a guy who was wrong on everything. Here's the media.
We begin the readout tonight with a message to Republicans. Okay, we get it. COVID is the precious, and you love it. You love COVID so much you want it to spread in the schools, at the office, in the Walmart, on the cruise ships, and at the club.
Most of the people I know who are vaccinated are irritated and really impatient at this point with those who are refusing for whatever reason to do this easy thing to save us from this nightmare pandemic.
The people who are not getting vaccines, who are believing the lies on the internet instead of science, it's time to start shaming them. What else? Or leave them behind. Because they are keeping the majority of Americans behind.
He's stupid. But what a ginned up conflict. These creeps are like America's gym teacher forcing us to play shirts and skins dodgeball when what we really want to do is play spin the bottle. It makes you wonder about the other conflicts you saw on TV. For example, was there really a conflict between all black people and police? Or was it largely a narrative created for eyeballs and angst? Eyeballs and angst. I think I saw them open for 9 Inch Nails. Or how about rich versus poor? What if the poor don't hate the rich? They just want to be rich, and the rich would be thrilled to help because it's not a zero-sum game. But where are the ratings in that? You don't have breaking news every time a plane lands safely, but put 2 passengers beating the living out of each other on that plane, then come talk to me.
That said, millions of Americans still tune into this crap and think they're being informed when they're really just being fed a distorted, hyper-partisan worldview and just being fed a lot of hype and propaganda. But anyway, millions of people still tune into this stuff, and here they are being told that people like me are the problem. People like me are endangering the lives of everybody else. Where do you think that could lead? I mean, this is getting pretty close to incitement here. I mean, if you have a cable news audience, millions or tens of millions of people, and you're getting up on the air and demonizing a group of people, telling your audience that they're the problem, that they're endangering the lives of everybody else. Yeah, that's pretty close to incitement. I don't know exactly where the line is or if they crossed it, but they're pretty close to the line at that point. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have a lot of faith in people, especially people that get their information from cable news. And I can look back at the lessons of history and remember that there was times when people were hunting down the witches that lived in their village and burning them at the stake. You know, there was times when whole populations of people largely turned a blind eye to things like gulags and concentration camps. And the thing is, those people are no different than you or I today. So given the right set of circumstances, I think people today are perfectly capable of doing the most horrible things that were ever recorded in the pages of history. And if you think that you're above that, you think, oh no, I'm way smarter than those people that lived in the past. You know, if you're actually conceited enough to think that you're that much better than your predecessors, in my mind that means you're more likely to engage in the atrocities of the day because you lack the self-awareness to confront your own nature. You know, the conceit of what they call presentism reminds me a lot of in the New Testament, the exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, where Jesus says to the Pharisees, I mean, you say within yourselves, if we had been alive in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have been partakers in the blood of the prophets. You know, if we had lived way back when our fathers did, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. Yeah, I think you would have been. You just admitted that you were the sons of the people that killed the prophets, and B, you knew they were going to kill him. So yeah, human nature doesn't change. The people of the past aren't any different than the people in the present psychologically, given the right circumstances. They're capable of all sorts of terrible things. The best defense against that is to have the humility to acknowledge that, reflect on your thoughts and behaviors, and make sure you're not going down a very ugly, dangerous path. In addition to not watching much cable news, I also don't watch the late night corporate comedians. Now, I actually like comedy, but I like comedy that's actually funny. And to be funny, you need 2 elements. A, it's got to be clever. You know, the delivery's got to be good. And B, it's got to be truthful. And frankly, I don't find much truth in Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert or any of the other barely talented hacks that basically just deliver lines that were written for them. And clearly, much like the cable news networks, they just have a target audience that they're feeding a narrative to, and I don't find much humor in that. It's not clever. There's not much truth in it. Ergo, I don't find much humor in it. But during the pandemic, a lot of those people decided to pile on people like me.
Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
Here's the crowd from UNC Virginia Tech game this weekend that did not require vaccination and where almost no one was wearing a mask.
Anyone who's unvaccinated and needs to be in the hospital for COVID, they should just say, no, we're sorry. We told you to get vaccinated and you didn't. So you're done. That's it. Go home. and take that horse dewormer.
Personal foul, failure to protect yourself and others sets the country back 5 years, still fourth wave.
We should start a rumor on Facebook that eating Play-Doh cures the flu.
I don't want to suggest that Kimmel's show has become boring and predictable, but last night during the taping, people in the studio audience were changing the channel.
Some even suggested that people like me, if we do get sick, the hospitals should just refuse to treat us because, well, we didn't get our vaccination. So we deserve what we get. Really, how far are you willing to take that logic? Because there's a lot of comorbidities that make you more likely to get severe COVID and more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to die from COVID. And some of those comorbidities you really can't do anything about. You know, if you're 80 or 90, the passage of time really isn't your fault. What about obesity? Probably half the country or better is overweight, and a non-insignificant number of those people fit the clinical criteria of being morbidly obese. Not only does that make you more susceptible to severe COVID, but that makes you more susceptible to all sorts of things that will land you in the hospital. So are you going to apply the same logic to those people? Should we turn them away from the hospitals when they show up? During the pandemic, were you going up to, if you saw somebody that's overweight eating a donut, did you go slap it out of their hands and say, "Are you trying to kill my grandmother?" Because if the argument is, I'm endangering people's lives by refusing to get an experimental vaccine, experimental treatment that has no long-term studies. Did I mention that? There's no long-term safety data on these treatments. What about all the people that overeat and don't take care of themselves? They have weakened immune systems. They're more likely to get severe COVID. Are they endangering the life of your grandmother? What about smokers? There's another one. What about people that drink too much? That suppresses their immune system. If you're going out drinking a few nights a week, are you trying to kill my grandmother? Not taking care of yourself? That night you spent out partying and drinking, I mean, that suppresses your immune system. You don't get a good night's sleep. Your immune system's suppressed. You're more likely to get severe COVID. You're more likely to take up somebody's hospital bed. So should we turn those people away from the hospital? How far are you going to take that logic? Now you might say, well, Fletch, overeating and drinking and smoking, those are all addictive behaviors. We should have sympathy for those people. But there's no reason you can't go out and get this experimental vaccine. Did I mention that there's no long-term safety data on these treatments? These treatments that you're demanding that I go out and get? Now I feel that I've only scratched the surface and how terrible some COVID policies were and how terrible some people acted during the pandemic. We could talk about extended lockdowns and closing the schools for a year and a half, 2 years in some places. We could talk about in California, them keeping the beaches shut down for months on end, even long after the data was out, and we knew that you're not going to get COVID walking around outdoors. You get COVID locked in close quarters with other people that have COVID. And actually, sunlight is good for you, and it actually helps boost your immune system within reason. Another comorbidity is vitamin D deficiency. And of course, one way to get adequate vitamin D is through diet. Another way is to be out in the sunshine and get sunlight on your skin. Being out in the fresh air. Yet Governor Newsom and the leadership in California decided to keep the beaches shut down for months on end. Same thing with gyms. Another comorbidity is being in bad physical shape. In a lot of places, they kept the gyms shut down for months on end. But like I said, I could get into detail on a lot of these different policies, but I don't want to make this video 3 hours long. So to wrap it up, seeing that people are the way they are, and something like this is likely to happen again in the future. Hopefully not again in my lifetime, but I'm not going to hold my breath. It's probably will have another pandemic in the next few decades. How should one prepare themselves for this? Well, if money was no object, if I was a millionaire, maybe I'd go build a underground bunker somewhere and stock it with non-perishable foods, and when the next pandemic comes around, I'll just bug out and disappear for 18 months until it blows over and people start behaving rationally again, but it's not a viable option for a lot of people. One thing you could do that a lot of people, that's more viable for people, is choosing a different zip code. Moving to a state like Florida, where I loved DeSantis's COVID policy. I think Florida is a good example of a state actually trying to follow the science, trying to follow the data, and enacting reasonable COVID policies. Contrast that with like places like New York or California. Definitely have no desire to move to either of those places. And maybe you can't uproot yourself and move to a totally different state, but maybe you can move to a different place within that state. In my state, the places with the most draconian policies, the places with the longest lockdown periods, were the blue parts of the state, the major urban areas that are lorded over by progressive politicians. Thankfully, I don't have to live in those areas either. The places where I live, hardly anybody was a mask Nazi. They didn't flip out on you if they saw you walking around without a mask, and nobody really cared about your vaccination status. They weren't ready to demonize you and treat you like a second-class citizen if you refused to get an experimental treatment that has no... Did I mention that there's no long-term safety data on this? I feel like I might be repeating myself. So to the extent that you can insulate yourself from the populations that are likely to go crazy during the next pandemic, that would be a good measure in my opinion. And even more practical measure is try to be as healthy as possible. Make sure your immune system is optimized. Make sure your lifestyle is optimizing your immune system. Eat right. Get adequate exercise. Get adequate vitamin D in your diet, or get outdoors and get it from the sunshine. Get adequate sleep. Sleep deprivation is a huge factor in your immune system. Find a good work-life balance so that you're getting adequate rest and that you're at your best, then you're more likely to be able to fend off any pathogen that should come your way. Anyway, that's my thoughts and observations about what I observed during the pandemic. Let me know yours in the comment section below, and thanks for watching the video. You've been watching the Flutch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.